Awesome. Happy morning, happy afternoon, happy evening to everyone who has joined. So let me quickly start sharing my screen and let's get started. Awesome. Hope my screen is visible.
Uh, yes, really.
Awesome. So as Kishore said, today our session is going to be on building and scaling a design system from the ground inside your design team, entirely from a designer's perspective. Before I uh, step into talking about design systems, so a bit about myself. I'm Srinivasan. I'm currently a product
Srini,
designer.
sorry to interrupt. So I couldn't see. I can see your screen, but I couldn't see the presentations or slides. Anything?
Okay, just give me a second.
Yeah.
Sure, what's going on? Is it visible now?
Uh, no, I think I'm getting a blank screen. I can see the baby interface here, but I couldn't see the slides.
All right, so probably let me start sharing my entire screen so that it's visible.
All right.
Is it visible now?
Yes, we are good to go. We have your screen.
Yep. Awesome. So I want to start with an introduction about myself. So currently I'm a product designer at Norton. Norton is a company which does a suite of consumer cyber safety applications. I specifically I take care of the iOS products as a sole product designer for a product called Norton 360, which is Norton's flagship product. So earlier, like I worked with brands like Google and so forth, as a product designer. So my career like started as an as an engineer. Like I did my bachelor's in computer science, and then eventually I was looking forward to become a web developer. But things changed, and I wanted to become a product designer, which led me to these phenomenal companies. Eventually, after gaining some experience back in India, like I wanted to pursue a master's, where I could, equip my skills and become better at it. So, which led me to doing my master's in human computer interaction at DePaul University. A few things that I'm passionate about are design systems, multi-model interactions. Like recently, so we see a lot of multi-model interfaces around, which interest me, and also like system thinking, which you will see during the course of the presentation. All right, so that was a little bit about me, and let's try to keep it under an hour because I know there are a few folks joining from India, and we have an IPL game today with Chennai Super Kings and Mumbai Indians, equally excited for that. So let's try to keep it within an hour, and I'll leave you guys. Awesome. So let's get started with the main topic. Um, so what we're going to really see in this presentation, like we see an introduction on what this presentation will be about, and stages in building and structuring a design system from the ground up, and also like how do you really test a design system and measure the impact within your design team, and also we'll leave 15 to 20 minutes for a short QA session. All right. So when I want to really talk about design systems, so I went over to Google and I just want to like Google search on what really uh, what people are really interested in with design systems. So I just like type in create a design system. So all what I could see are how do I create a design system on a tool, which is ultimately not how you create a design system. So it can just be a part of building a design system within your organization, but or the way it's implemented. But ultimately, you don't directly go into a tool like similar to your design process. You have a process around it. So here, if you see, like, there are these different types of buildings treated similar to your product or your design team. So each team has its specific requirements, and each team is of a different scale and size. So what you see here, so there are like two things involved in the construction of a building. So you have this main architecture and other the tools and the construction materials that you use. So similar to this, if you see, so we'll have a core architecture for building a product or a design system, and also like we have the tools. So we'll ignore the tools portion for this presentation, and then like focus solely on the architecture and the steps or the steps that you can take. Like, you can use it for any product. Like, you can take this whole um, step of steps of like, creating a design system, and you can use it with any tool, or like, even when you're like, designing like, multiple products, or like, building products in multiple mediums. So as I said, we solely focus on the architecture of building a design system. So let's start with what are design systems. So to put it in a simpler way, there are like n number of definitions that's available online. So I would put it in a really, really simple way. Design system is a set of reusable components and patterns guided by clear principles and standards. With that said, let's just get into the process of how do you like really create a design system. So there are 4 stages involved in this whole process. So you start with discovery and strategy. So the steps you see here, it's very similar to creating a product. So you start with discovery and strategy, and then you get to design and scale, and also distribute and test it among your team members, and also like measure the impact of it at a later point. So let's start with our first step in the whole design system process, which is about discovery. So what do you really do in discovery? So identify the need for the design system, like have a strong why on like on the need for a design system. What problem are you really solving the design system, and what timeline are you really looking to accomplish these goals? So a few whys and whens, like on like when to start a design system is like when your team has hit scale. Like there are a couple of designers, there are a couple of developers, and like you have like found your market fit, and like built the product. So that would be the right time to start. So if you're still like in the process of identifying a market fit, or still like coming up with a product, like I wouldn't strongly recommend this, because like you keep especially in early stage startups, like you get to iterate over time. Like especially in the earlier stages, you get to iterate a lot, and at that time, like you really don't get a proper time or resources to focus on building a design system. And also when you wanted to reduce implementation decisions and inefficiencies, and remove any knowledge silos, or and establish consistency and standards, and also like when you want to enable scalability. So we'll see how we can really tackle these problems in the coming slides. So first of all, like even before you start designing something, like or building a design system, like so design systems is not a write it and done effort. So it's an iterative process, like that combines these 4 pillars of the product development process: research, design, engineering, and management. For which even before you start with the discovery process, you need an alignment with the stakeholders. So pitching like the need for the design system on the few whens and whys that we talked earlier, like to your design and research team, and also to your management and engineering team to get consensus. Because ultimately, like you're a resource, and like you're like going to build the design system, which is going to take a fair amount of time, in which your efforts are involved, and which has to be conveyed to the management, and also like align with the uh, engineering team to kind of later like develop it for the product. Definitely expect pushback when you pitch in a design system with management and engineering. So a few factors that you can use to pitch in a design system is really like, for management, you can just say, okay, what is the time to like, what is the impact that I can achieve in like, the time to market, like, I can see a drastic increase in time to market and cost reduction of resources and resource optimization. And also for engineering, like, you can really pitch in on these modular design, like, where you have these reusable components, images or styles, and then also like improve communication where you need not handle or like hand over specifications each and every time, which we call red line specs, like each and every time, and making the handoff process a lot more simpler. So a few research activities that you can start with the whole discovery process is to audit the mediums, elements, interfaces that you're currently like designing or like, even have developed. And also like you can explore any existing interactions and like, addressing any inconsistencies that you want to. And also a lot of mistakes that people do is they don't really get to speak to the potential users. So they can be designers in your team, like, different types of designers, interaction designers, visual designers. So just speak to them to understand, like, what they really need in the design system. A simple component audit would do, like, like I mentioned the previous slide, like identifying elements and its variations, and also like you could just get the counts on the number of occurrences, and you could just create a spreadsheet or like, a table out of it to later, like, help us in prioritizing the components that we need to build. And also, as I mentioned, speak to the users, like, collect qualitative requirements. So here you see some statements, like, that I have received, like, when building my design system. So you can use these qualitative requirements and then like later incorporate it in the process of building a design system. So some of the major don'ts, like some mistakes that some
Srini, sorry to interrupt. So can you please click on that hide option? So some people aren't able to see the text on your slide. The hide option in the screen share. No. Yeah. Yeah.
Got it.
Thanks so much.
Got it. Yep. So some of the major don'ts, like that I would recommend, like, some mistakes that people do when, like, starting their design system is they start replicating a popular design system. Like, okay, we have Google Material Design, or like, Atlassian has a whole design system that's like pretty much open source. Like, we can just take that and then just like, start replicating it. But that doesn't make the cut because, like, as I mentioned in the first slide, like, each team is of a different scale and each team is building a different product. Some teams might have a core web product, and some teams, like, have their core products on mobile platforms, or like, a different platform. Like, it could be even a wearable or like a VR or an augmented reality experience. So I wouldn't, like, recommend, like, blindly start replicating a popular design system. And also don't start without knowing what is important for your product, as I mentioned. So speak to your users, like identify, to a component audit on, like, to identify what's really important for the product that could really make an impact. So now that we'll have all the research data after these activities, now it's time to, like, for us to strategize on how we're going to start with these design systems and, like, eventually build and scale over time. So I would recommend using this principle called as Pareto principle, which says that, like, your 20% of effort bring 80% of the benefit. So you've done your component audit and you've done your qualitative research, which you can use and prioritize the set of elements that will make the maximum impact with your 20% of work. So ideally, like, if you're a mid-sized company or even a large-scale company, when you're building a design system from the scratch, you initially don't get the complete resource for building a design system. You scale it over time. And like, most of the design teams that I've worked in, like I've worked as a part-time uh, I worked as a part-time design systems person, like rather than being a dedicated person. So you really like have to prioritize on things that will make the maximum impact, where you can like prove the worth of design systems to the management at a later point uh, to hire and dedicated resources. So you wanted to like establish a clear goal, like now that you have a strategy of like prioritizing competence, and then you wanted to establish a clear goal for which like you could use um, uh, the OKR method, like which I use regularly. Like you could use any type of any type of statements, or you wanted to like you can define hypothesis and like have a measurable goal. So in this objectives and key results method, so you can define uh, a simple objective. So this is a sample that I've used. Like, so let's say you want to standardize like foundation and components as an objective, and then like how will it be measured? Like measured by reusability and consistency. But this is like really a broad goal. Like how do you like really break it down and then like establish like smaller goals? That will be our next step in creating a proper roadmap. So you can split it into multiple phases. Like you start with your initial validation, and then like building out your style guide and component library, and then later also develop and adopt it in the product, for which like each phase requires uh, collaboration with different stakeholders. Like for example, phase one can be done by you and with resource team, and phase two with the members in the team, and then phase three, like when you want to really develop and adopt it into your product, like you want the engineering team. So you can really strategize it in this way. So this again looks broad, like the phase approach. Detailing it further, you can detail the whole roadmap on like the first point that we talked, like what is the time that you're going to take to achieve this design system. So which could be split into quarterly goals or monthly goals, or like even a sprint level goal, where these basic components are like the stuff that you see here, which you have identified as the elements that will make the maximum impact. So you can just prioritize it as a roadmap, and then which you can like pitch it to your design leaders, or like or which you can collaborate with management engineering before you start building it out. So the next step is like, now that we have clearly identified, prioritized, the next step is designing. And so if you see the first approach that came into existence, which was proposed by Brad Frost, was the atomic design system. So although like atomic design, it's a phenomenal system for like building your design system. Like I've used it in several instances, but I came across this structure where which is being used in the Predix design system by General Electronics, which has simplified the whole process. So the whole pro between like using an atomic design system and this whole Predix design, the structure of atomic design system versus the structure of the Predix design system is it's highly scalable, like where you can go beyond templates. So the highest level of structure that you see is template and atomic design or pages. But eventually, like when you wanted to achieve this at scale, like you scale it to features and even applications. So when you want to do that, I think this Predix design system is highly scalable, and which I would recommend. Here again, like I wouldn't say like this is kind of a rule, or like I would say it's just a recommended way of like structuring your design system. So here, if you see, like I've compared it to the atomic design system. So the highest level, as I mentioned, is pages, which is which doesn't like scale beyond that. So ultimately, like when you're when you're a single product and when you want to scale to multiple products, features, and applications, the predicts design system plays a major role in scaling that. So let's look at each component in the whole structure, and then see what they can contain and how do you really scale, and also followed by an example. So the first things are the basics where you have your principles. So what are ideally design principles? So it has to ideally reflect your brand, and it has to help in making these design decisions from your colors to typography or buttons, or any component that you're going to design at a later point. So I'm not generalizing the type of components. It could be literally anything. It could be a data visualization, but ideally, how are you really going to project your brand? Like, what is the personality that your brand will have? So these are defined in principles. Like, a few can be as you see on the slide, these are a few design principles grabbed from from design systems that exist. So ideally, principles reflect the personality of your brand, and will help you making the design decisions that you're going to take across the product. So next, you go with the basics or the foundations of your design system. So these are essentials, which you will ideally use to build, later, which you will use to build your components or pages or even your features. So these are the base elements that you're really going to use. It could be your brand guidelines, the colors, typography, your accessibility and motion guidelines. These are really essential, before you even start putting out a component or your grid system, your motion design guidelines. This could again, you need this. This can't be built in a day, right? So that's where you have clearly established your roadmap on what you want to build in a specific timeline. But these are good examples on what could be the basics, or what are really the basics in a design system. So eventually, when you build out your basics, you have a strong foundation, which you use to scale it to components. So components are nothing but working or actionable elements in an interface. So they should have a defined purpose on what problem that the component is solving, have do's and don'ts of a component, and address multiple interaction states, and also if you're doing a cross-platform product, you can accommodate it to different platforms, screen sizes, and devices. A few known examples can be your buttons, navigation bar, or simple checkboxes, or a group of checkboxes. So these can be some day-to-day examples that you see. So this would be again after you eventually when you build your roadmap, you have, when you've done your audits, you just deploy the same approach in building these components, is to put it in your roadmap and identify, okay, these are all the components that will make the maximum impact or has the maximum reusability. So I'm going to prioritize it and bring it inside the system. So let's really move on to templates. So templates are nothing but repeatable pages or a set of interaction. For example, compare the checkout page, the checkout process involves a shopping website. The checkout process involves adding an item to the cart and checking out. So here your checkout page can be a template, which can be used all across the product. This again, inherits multiple components that you have earlier created in the design system. So until here, you could easily build it and then adopt it in your design system, even with the existing methods and processes. But what if you wanted to scale? What if you wanted to build multiple applications? Some companies have different business models where they wanted to pitch in different features to different users, or different user groups, and eventually those could be combined to make an application. But so in this case, that's where the whole structuring makes sense. where you scale it into features and applications. So features are nothing but clearly defined interactions between multiple templates that you have created, which solve specific user needs, which could be a set of features can be again and its interactions can be inherited into an application. So why this model is really useful, why am I really pitching this model? So ideally, when you scale to multiple features and applications, so you want this flexibility to interchange features and applications, into multiple, as I mentioned, each business has their user model where they wanted to um, serve users with specific features on a specific product. So when you establish it on a design level, it will be easily accommodator for multiple applications. Let's say you're defining a feature, you could use it in application 1, application 2, and application 3 extra. And also similarly, these features are again swappable, which could you could pick out just a single feature out of your 5 or 10 features, and then you could build an application out of it, which solves a user problem, and you could literally sell it, and then that will have a whole different business bringing in revenue. So that's why I strongly recommend this model, when you really work on companies that are scaling fast, that you want when you want to expand to uh, multiple products. So here, as I mentioned earlier, so you define your components, and then you have your features, and then an application is a whole set of features, and which are when defined, and you have your interactions between your multiple features. So as I defined, feature 1 and feature 2 could be an application, could be a whole different application, which could create a new business model for you. Feature 1 and feature 3 uh, could be a different application which solves a specific user need. So you're really bringing in this whole approach of modular design into your organization right from the ground up when you're building the design system. So that's where it's highly impactful. So theories aside, I just want to explain this whole process with a simple example, so that it's more clear and understandable. Let's take an example of Apple Pay. So Apple Pay is a service which lets you pay through the cards that you have already added to your Apple Pay account. So it's predominantly used in US, Canada, and a few other countries. So here, if you look at Apple Pay, this is a template where you see when you wanted to pay, this template comes out using what card that you want to use, which address you use if you're using an online service, and it's just a template that's existent on iPhones. It started the whole Apple Pay product or the feature started with iPhones. So here, if you see in the model that we use, so here, if you see the branding, you see the Apple logo, which comes under basics, and the icons, which again comes under basics, and the address picker can be a component together, form pattern or a template, which could be eventually scaled to multiple platforms. So here, if you see Apple Pay is your template, and then when you scale it eventually across multiple platforms, if you see Apple Pay started with iPhones, and then recently they scaled it to macOS and also to watchOS. So you have these clearly defined interactions. So multiple I mean, you've already defined all your interactions at a core level, which could be accommodated to the respective platform. So you've taken one feature and then scaled it across multiple platforms. So the feature is being scaled, and also not only does Apple Pay work on simple Apple products, they are also scalable to third-party applications. So this whole Apple Pay feature is taken inside Wallet. So Wallet is an app that you use to have your boarding passes, your entry tickets, have your debit cards. So in comparing it to our structure that we proposed, the wallet is the core application, and the Apple Pay is a part of it. And also, when you use it in your third-party applications, let's say you're tapping on Buy with Apple Pay, you get this whole experience of Apple Pay, which you have already defined it in a component level, which can be used in any third party, used and integrated in any third party application. So you understand the scalability of it, right? Like you started with a simple component, eventually scale it to a template, and then which becomes a feature which are being used in, like, not just one application, but multiple applications. You have clearly defined a framework. So you could just, like, this is just a simple example for your understanding, but you can but features can be, like, really complex. Like you can just, like, build out these complex interactions like edge cases and use cases, and then eventually scale it to a feature which can be used across any number of applications. With that said, let's come to this interesting discussion of implementation tools. So as I mentioned in my first slide, like, people are more interested in designing their design system. Like, okay, what tool should I really use? Uh, I would highly recommend, like, using the tool that your team is comfortable with. Earlier, like, I would say before a year or two, it was Sketch. So if you go to YouTube and say, or like, if you just Google search on uh, how do I really create a design system? So there would be all these list of Sketch tutorials, and now it's all Figma tutorials, and there could be Framer tutorials, or, like, origami. So I still know people, like, I still know teams who don't even use any of these tools, and they have their own designs. They have their own uh, design tool, but eventually, like, there could be a new tool too. So how would you, like, these tutorials, like, really don't help. Of course, like, they are helpful, like, when you wanted to, like, build it in a specific tool. Um, but I would highly recommend, like, to maintain the structure and everything similar, which you could, like, accommodate it to any tool. Like, now you could be using Figma, you could just accommodate this whole structure that we defined earlier, like, the structure of the design system, where you start with basics and then go on to the application. So you could just use the very same structure when defining elements that could be, like, scalable to any tool, even if there is a new tool in the future. We never know. So all we can do is, like, we can have the same structure and, like, follow the best practice of tools, but there is no defined tool that you need to use. Use something that is really comfortable with your team, and which helps you distribute the design system across the team. Let's come to an interesting thing called documentation. So now that you have clearly, like, established a roadmap, started building it, but how do I really, like, uh, inform it to the team? So that's where documentation plays a major role when you want to remove friction within the team. Informing, okay, what is this component really solve? Like, what are the do's and don'ts of it? It's like similar to a manual for your users. They get a knowledge about the usage, on, like, when to use this component, when not to. And also here again, some people have an established web page, but that's not really necessary. You can use any comfortable medium. Like, it could just be a Word document. It could even be a Notion template, or a simple, like, a text document. But ultimately, the goal of documentation is removing friction within your team, in educating the team about, like, uh, about the usage of the elements or your components or your brand guidelines. So a documentation could be as simple as this, when you want to inform your users about a specific component's name and its description, examples illustrating a component's name, variation states, and other dimensions. And also you could use some designed references on when to use and when not to use guidelines for these visuals and interactions. So it could be for any component. So here you just see an example. It could be for the colors guides, for example, like okay, red color is for my alert, like, so what problem that color is solving, and like how do I use it in my interface? So it could be as simple as that. You could, if you just like cover these points, these are the necessary things that your team needs to know when you have built a built a component or an element into your design system. So here again, we come to an interesting part. So now,
sorry to interrupt. Like people have some couple of questions regarding this these examples and all those stuff. So I think it would be better like if we can go through the questions before we jump onto the next part of the presentation.
Sure, definitely, yeah, sure.
All right. So better I will read out the questions.
Mm-hmm.
So Dave has the question, like in the example, the Apple Pay interaction looks different on iPhone, desktop, and watch. How is the scaling from the same design system? They have totally different working or looks.
Right. Interesting question. So here again, like the core architecture has remained the same. So, but Apple uses like different human interface guidelines for their different platforms. But if you see like the overall structure remains the same. Like on like what's inside the feature, and they have just like taken the whole feature and then just scaled it according to their platform needs. If you see the human interface guidelines, so I just want to state it out as an example. So I thought it would be a simple example, but like they have their own design or visual guidelines for each of their platform accommodating user needs. So they maintain the whole structure and interactions, but they have just like accommodated it according to their platform, like each platform guideline. So in that case, like the feature has maintained its core properties, but just the skin of it has changed. So that's where like that's where like the system plays a role. So I think it answers your question.
All right. So next question is from SK. So by address picker, do you mean the drop down option?
I didn't get the question.
So I think they are mentioning about the example you showed, like in the Apple Pay scenario, like they are asking like by the address picker, do you mean the drop down option?
Right. So let's say like you're just like paying it out, and like you wanted to pick out a card, like a different card. So here what you see here, like and also to answer like SK's earlier question, if you see the core information architecture is the same, and the set of interactions. So here just that it's been accommodated to the respective platform. So here if you see, if you tap on this whole card, I mean, you pick out a different card using this. This could be a separate component, and this could be like if you're like buying it from an online site, this could be a different component. So that's what I called out as an address picker. Or this is just an example. It could be the card picker or an address picker. I just want to call out with an example. Hope that answered your question.
So we have a couple more questions. So the next one is from Rajakrishnan. Any specific considerations you have before you decide what would be a component in your design system? You mentioned toggle states, but anything else?
Can you just repeat that question? I didn't.
Sure. Yeah. Any specific considerations you have before you decide what would be a component in your design system? You mentioned like a toggle states. Anything else?
Right. So as I mentioned, like anything that builds up your interface, like it could be. So I just called out a few examples. So you could be even designing a data visualization tool. In that case, your like multiple variants of data visualization can be a component, like which inherits these principles of these principles and basics like colors, typography, etc. So anything that builds up your interface from a smaller level. So these colors, like you can't literally use those colors, like inside. Like you can't say that it's a component. Like the user will never know. But anything that's interactive from the ground up level for the users, like, I would define that as a component.
So next we have a question from Ashish. What if they don't read these documentations? I think busy schedule. Any way to better engage the stakeholders?
Right, interesting question. So that's like really like, up to you, like on evangelizing your design system. So treat it something like this, when you ultimately buy a product, let's say you're buying a product from IKEA. When you want to build that product, like when you wanted to assemble that product, like you really need a tutorial or a manual. Similar to that is the documentation that we have. So probably like, when you distribute your design system, you could probably like, write an inbuilt note, or like, or put a comment saying that, hey, on like, when you need to know when to use or how to use this, like, refer to the specific link, which you can like, put it out as a comment in a design tool. Or when you even introduce your design system to the team, you can just say, hey, this is just a UI kit, and when you need to know the actual working of it, you just need to refer this document on when to use and when not to use. So probably evangelizing is the best solution to like, promote your documentation.
All right. So, folks, like, if you like have any questions, please drop it in the Q&A tab, so that we have the track of questions, so that we can come to the questions later. And if you drop the questions in general tab, like there are chances like it may get easily lost in the conversation. So if you have any questions, drop it in the Q&A tab. What do you think? You can continue the presentation.
Awesome. So we just stopped with the documentation and continuing like, so now that you have established all these UI kits and then the documentation, how do you really distribute and test this? Is like, again, a core part of a design system. So here again, you can use your comfortable tool for distribution. So you can use your design tool itself, like, or some companies even have their own plugins or like, own way of like, distributing. As you see here, this is a way of like, distributing in a more comfortable format that people would be like, familiar in using the design system. And also like coming to this area of distribution, so you really need to keep a track on like, what versions, how many versions you've published, or to keep track of changes or additions related to a version number. So let's say you're publishing like, version 1. So what does it really contain? So which would be like, ultimately said in the change log, but you also need a version number that relates to it. This could be a structure where you start with a major version number, and then like how you similarly like, version a product, release to minor release to patch releases to fixes. So which could ideally reflect in your change logs. So this could be a simple change log that you could write when you publish each version of design system. It could be your simple release notes on like, if anything new has been added, anything has been fixed. Like let's say you like clearly nested all these colors in typography into your design system, and those didn't get reflected for some reason. That could be in your components. That could really be a bug. Like if you had fixed that, like, you could just put here and any specification. So I was coming to this point like of having the specs like, integrated into the whole changelog document, and which could be still which could be still referred by the designers for each release. And also a few more things that you can add. You can add any important updates or like any deprecated components when you eventually scale and release like, multiple versions of design systems. So post distributing, how do you like really test a design system? Until now there is no proven way to like, do a usability testing. But what you could do is like, especially in this remote world, you could like, test something like the usability of the library and its structure. establish collect net promoter score on asking the users to rate, okay, once you have published a version of design system, you could request the users about how comfortable they felt, which you could partner with your research team. So as I mentioned, align with your research team and figure out a way on how you can really uh, test your design system on its structure. It could be about the satisfaction of the users. Probably you could establish baseline scores and keep repeating these usability testing over a span of weeks or months to get the actual results. And also, these usability testing could help you identify advocates within your team. So advocates are your teammates, who would really evangelize your design system. So to answer to a previous question, you could use these advocates to really spread out your documents, or to spread out the importance of the design system, which you keep repeating and which improves over time. This could be a sample where you could just pick out X number of participants and say X were able to identify and use the components, and what went wrong with people who weren't able to, and as I said, having a net promoter score for your design system. Test it similar to a product, deploy fun concepts like gamification. So to detail out on that, so it's just an experimental thing. As I said, there is no defined way for testing your design system in your team, but you can explore some fun concepts like gamification, where for level one, a participant is going to use all these simple components, and then later build out a page template, and then eventually scale to a feature. So you could have these multiple levels in which um, the people, the participants are going to learn about these simple components to larger features. And also, design system is something that you can't do actually a live usability testing on. It won't even let's say you can hand over a page to a participant and say, hey, build it with a design system. Let's see how quickly you're able to get to it. That doesn't really make the cut, because ultimately you don't want the speed of it or the time taken to do those things, but ultimately you wanted to know that how useful or how easily were they able to use the design system. So which is done in the process of designing a product. So you could collect some offline feedback, asking people for comments, suggestions, or anything that they have, or even simple questions, which could be later documented similar to. So these could be a simple feedback form that you use within your product. You can use a similar thing for a design system, and then seeking feedback, which is prioritized. And in case if they're similar to a ticketing system, which could be later inherent in the roadmap, and and then and can be built as we go along, having multiple having prioritizing the needs of the users, and really prioritizing it based on the earlier defined roadmap, making adjustments, and publishing it eventually, which will really make an impact. So you also get to hear from the users of the product, which in this case is a design system. And also allow contributions. So let's say you have a core team of design system, a core design system team. But what if there is an external person who wants to contribute to this whole design system? Let's say, which is by the existing components inside the design system. So that's when uh, you let in contributions, where you can define these contribution proposal framework, and asking where do you want this component, and what category does it come in, something that is not being solved by the existing elements in your design system, how is it different, asking for a simple description and example. And and later, like you can collaborate with the person who has, if it's valid, like you can collaborate with the person who really pitch this proposal. You can work with them to get that component inside the design system. You follow the same process from an end to end in building, in bringing that component or feature or an element. By this way, to really democratize the whole design system process, where it's not being built in silo. Like you also allow contributions, where you also increase the visibility of the design system. So the last part is like, how do you really measure the impact of the design system? So since we are uh, purely focusing on the whole design team, how do you really measure the impact of a design system over time? Probably some key metrics could be design time improvements, rapid concept prototyping, especially in mid-level companies. You get to do a lot of design pitches, where you present concepts to the clients. So it could be one of the key metrics. Handoff improvements and improvement in product quality and reduce in issues or bugs. You can just say, hey, there was a designer who handed off this way, so you could which was inconsistent. So you could reduce all of these, which you could later quantify to show its impact to the management. So the sample measurements could be this, let's say X number of teams or X number of products were able to achieve the reusability with XX% of adoption of this whole design system, and having a consistent and cohesive approach, post your design system launch, like you could just say, oh, our products have become consistent and cohesive, which you could show to the stakeholders, and also speeding up of iteration. So these are sample measurements, but the scale of your team. It could be a smaller team, larger team, or it could be multiple teams working on this. So you can, these are just sample measurements that you can use, that you can seek inspiration, but ultimately, you just have to prove the worth of your design system, in which these measurements will be really helpful. And ultimately, at the end of the day, you just want to show, how valuable is it to, as a product designer, how valuable is it, or what is it really doing for the product, where you could, project these cost and time reductions. So, so with the design system and without design system being compared, where the cost and time could be really saved, and also you could even project your reductions with where you have for designers. This is just a simple example. So your team could be smaller or larger than this, than the projected example. All you have to see is how you've gotten to reduce the time or cost in bringing up this design system. So with that you're creating by pitching and building a design system within your team. Just keep repeating this process. As I said, it's a completely iterative process. You could just publish one version and then learn from it, and then keep. So now that you have a complete framework from an end to end, you could just keep repeating this process over time, which can lead to a complete design system. And there again, you might have brand refreshes, you might have a new product coming out for which you need to accommodate your design system. So this framework from an end to end will help you in scaling from from audit. Let's say there is a new product coming up, you could repeat the same process in building new components or features, which could be a part of your design system. So you keep repeating this process from an end to end in order to maintain and achieve your goals using these design systems. And also moving forward, like one topic that we haven't really discussed, like which would take whole other another presentation, is collaborating with engineering. So which we can see probably in the next probably in another session. But when you really establish a design system within your team, within your design team, so this could so showing all these metrics or impact could really be a pilot to get buy-in, a pilot version to get a buy-in from engineering, which has happened in my case, and then later um, collaborate with them in engineering the whole design system, so that it's adopted inside the product. So this could be a phased approach, but these metrics, measurements, or the impact that is created uh, could really help you buy engineering, buying your engineering team, and really you get to drive and build the whole design system similar to a product. That's all I had for the day. I think people are already waiting with a lot of questions. So with that said, let's get right into the questions. Kishore, you can start firing the questions.
Sure, yeah. So we have a question from Nikhil. How do you share highly interactive or dynamic elements in the design system? Example, what happens when a CTA is clicked, a model or a page? What happens when you choose an KPI in analytics dashboard? There are hundreds of permutation combinations when it comes to interactivity, and it is not possible to build a design prototype. Can design system help here, and how?
It can. So that's where, if you wanted to go that detail into a design system, I totally agree. Each component has its own number of permutations and combinations. So that's when, I mentioned, use a tool of your choice to demonstrate. You could just so now there is a feature coming Figma called interactive components, or you could even use a tool like Framer, which is highly interactive, where you can literally build an interactive design system. In that case, when you have multiple permutations and combinations, you could just prototype all those things and then just point a link to that. The designers can really interact with it and see, okay, these are all the X and X use cases, which could be a part of your documentation. That's where I said, use the tool wisely of your choice. Let's say you want to go into that level of detail, for example, including motion details, and probably Sketch might not be the tool. Probably you'll have to use some advanced tools like Framer or Origami to hope that answers your question.
Oh, so the next question is, what happens if development area is the developers or engineers have no respect to the design system?
Was that again? Sorry, can you just repeat the question for me?
So the question is basically what happens if the developers or engineers doesn't respect the design system? They work they are not using any components, something like that.
Yeah, that's where I told you, right? You have to be an evangelist. Let's say you're building out a product. Let's say let's take for an example, you're building Gmail. Ultimately, when you go and talk to a person, you just evangelize the product. Hey, this is what I'm building. Just give it a shot. Use these. So that's when evangelizing plays a major role. So as I mentioned, during the testing phase, or during the communication phase, you start finding your advocates. So it could eventually, when you scale your design system, those could also be developers. When you collaborate and engineering, so there could be engineers who show great. Those people could be your evangelists, and in where you can educate, who can educate them, who can educate the team on the importance of it, and which will pretty much solve your problem. But ultimately, the answer to your question is find evangelists who know the importance of design system. So that would be the answer to it. But ultimately, I faced this situation as well. This is how I've solved the problem of evangelizing the whole design system.
That's cool. That's cool. Yeah. So the next question is, from where do we get this percentage data to show? I think they are asking about the measure part which you presented earlier.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So you can start tracking it over time. So why I didn't go into it in detail is ultimately you can't measure it instantly over a week after you've launched or even a month. You just have to really wait for it over a span of 6 to 7 months to ultimately know let's say a designer says okay, it took me I didn't know which component to use before adopting to a design system, but later on okay, I had these clear established guidelines, these clear variants I could use my design process. That must have obviously saved some time. That must have got the work done in a lesser time than compared to a previous state where he wasn't using a design system. So it has to be over time where you could collect these sample metrics or by speaking to the users, which you could collectively put together for those percentages. But ultimately you just have to be patient for those metrics. Those aren't really instant. Probably it can, even if you're a smaller team, it could even take until a year to get those metrics. So just keep keep watching how quickly things get designed, or keep observing people, or talk to them. That's where these usability testing are collecting literally speaking to the users, collecting these NPS scores or qualitative feedback really makes an impact in showcasing that.
Okay. We have one more question from SK. Can design system be only applicable in long-term projects?
Right. Interesting question. So I don't know what he means by long-term project. I think he's really meaning a quicker, simpler project that he wants to share. Ultimately, as a product designer, or think of it from a product perspective, you don't really stop your product with a single version, right? You keep iterating over time. There could be even if you're building it for a client, there could be version 1 or an MVP of it, and then there could be version 2 or version 3. So that you can keep in your design system. So I think so not on a longer run. I think he's talking about one-off solutions, where you just ship it once and leave it. So ultimately, working as a product designer, especially in a product company, usually doesn't happen. Product doesn't stop with a single version. So ultimately, if you're shipping one-off solutions, if you're shipping it for once, I would highly recommend you not investing time in the design system because ultimately it doesn't prove any impact the product.
So the next question is how to describe your project, what to mention in describing the project, side project expanding to design panelist. So kind of I couldn't understand the question.
Can you just repeat the question so that
yeah, I will repeat it. Yeah. How to describe your project, what to mention in describing the project, side project expanding to design panelist. Any suggestions are welcome.
I didn't quite really get the questions. Probably he just wants to do a design system as a side project. Is that the question? I'm not really getting the question. So if he can repost a clear version of the question, I can answer. But yeah, didn't really get the question. Cool. Sorry.
Okay, sure. Trishna, are you around? Please add some more details to the question so that we can better help you. So the next question is from Raj Krishnan. You mentioned a stage at which it would make sense to think about developing a design system, which makes sense for business and product stakeholders. But what about developers? How do you strike a balance here between tech feasibility of the firm and business potential of the firm? Any personal annotates would really helpful here.
All right. So, I mean, he really wants to know, how do you really bind developers, in building the design? The question is that right? Now, is that what he means? If that's so, ultimately, that's what I said. You can't really expect a major pushback from engineering when they wanted to, build a design system. So that's when I said, you could pitch on these pros, or where you could pitch on the impact which has made within the design team, and the impact that it will make with the engineering team. For example, company must have referred to specs, as our specifications are looking to like red line specifications, okay, what is the padding for this? What is spacing for this? So probably that could be the biggest buy-in, and we could start with simpler elements, like the most simplest of the elements, and then so that it doesn't really look complex at first, and then you could scale to larger elements. But definitely, I've had a lot of pushbacks, but an approach that has worked out for me is showing the impact of it, or saying something, saying statements or a few statements to the development team that, hey, it will solve X and X problem for you. You need not do X and X. So which those can be already had. When it's ideally solving a problem for the development team, they would be happy to adopt it and then spend some time on it. So in that case, they would also be willing to put in some effort or dedicated resource towards that. I think that will pretty much help you in adopting the design system material of the tech stack or feasibility. So, yeah.
Okay. So Krishna had a couple of points to her questions. So it's just if you want to explain the project that you have done, then what are the things that should be there so that the other designer would understand the project? Is that a good thing to explain why you choose a particular color or the design system, or just normally explain how the prototype works?
Right. Okay. Now I get the question. Probably so again, so I just walk you through the whole process. Again, you will not be building it in silo. You can have. So I didn't really have I didn't really explain about the whole design process of the components. That's a whole different topic. You're just bringing in components together, building something that you have already done and evaluated with your peers. But I think you could do specific usability tests on the components. When you wanted to pick out a color, you can just use multiple variations of it, and you could even test it through if it's accessible, if it reflects your brand guidelines, so all those things can be verified, and only after that it can be got into a component, which can be later, I would say, inherited within your design system. But ultimately, what I would say is don't do the usability testing after you bring a component inside the design system. Do it beforehand, even before you kind of do something. That would be the right approach to deal with it. Hope that answers your question.
All right. Yeah, I think we are running out of time. We have one final question. So can you recommend any documentation tool to connect to storybook and design system documentation?
Okay, so that again, I don't want to vouch for any tool, I haven't even used the storybook tool that you're mentioning. So probably because in the organizations that I work in and scale design system, they have their own internal tools. But probably look out for any help documentations that the specific tool provides, because I haven't really used the tool. Um, so yeah, it could be even a simpler approach. Like even if you want to don't if you don't want to dedicate a specific tool for the documentation, you could just use simple things like um, Notion or even Word document is fine. You need not go that complex. So the medium of documentation can be really the last priority, because ultimately the need that it's serving is inform the users about what they could. It's like a manual, so manual can be of any format. So that could be the last thing that you have to really think about, especially when you're in the setup stage. You really need not go too detailed into the tools that you use for documentation.
That's cool. So I think we are came to end of this session. So thanks everyone for joining. We will be sending out the event recordings in another couple of days. We'll be sending the newsletters to the registered email IDs. So thanks Srini, thanks for joining. So it was really a insightful session. It's been an hour session. It was really insightful stuff, straightly getting into the tool and building the components. You just touch base the basics of what is design system and how to build and scale it up. It was really insightful for me as well. So thanks for everyone. Please do share your comments. We have dropped in our LinkedIn handles in this chat section. If you haven't joined the chapter page, please do join the chapter. We have some interesting sessions in the pipeline. And also do let us know if you need part 2 for this design system session.
Awesome. Thanks to the folks who joined today. And as I said, design system is a really broad topic, which can be covered in a 40-minute or a 1-hour session. But this is just a brief overview. You can reach out to me for any questions in specific. I think Kishore has a link to my LinkedIn profile, and also you can reach out in my social handles. So yeah, happy to answer your questions offline too. Through the session. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Have a great week. Bye-bye.